This film centers around the relationship between language and the land. Being that as the central core of this film, it is important to acknowledge the land that it was shot on. The images of nature that you see on this film are all shot in the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. It is important to know whose land you're living on, and additionally to know that it is unceded. These land acknowledgements are not a checkbox, they are important.
For this project, I struggled to find a direction. I felt as though I was taking in all this information, and although I felt very interested in all of it, I couldn't find a focus. After many days of thoughts and anxiety, I came to the realization that the answer had been right in front of me. Since the beginning of the term, I had become drawn to go outside into nature again. I was drawn to look at the land that I reside on and to get to know it more, to look at the trees, the leaves, the ocean, and the animals that live just a couple kilometers away from where I sleep. I have the tendency to rush everything that I do, but it was different when I would go on these walks in the forest. I paused and looked at the greenery around me. It became clear that I wanted to center this project on the land. I never used to think about language very much. I viewed it as a simple means to an end to communicate with others. Even when I was in high school, I dreaded all the language courses because I thought they were extremely boring. However, something that I've always cherished is the time that I spend outside. For 3 years, I worked at a summer camp that put a lot of emphasis on outdoor education and appreciation. Every day I got to go outside and I was surrounded by nature and the lake. Later in my life, and to my surprise, I became very interested in linguistics at university, and this led me to want to learn more about the languages of British Columbia, a place that I've lived in since I was born. An immediate theme that jumped at me right away when I began to read more about Indigenous languages is their connection to the land. It was an entirely new perspective to language that is not taught in any language course that I've ever taken. Lewis Cardinal from the Woodland Cree First Nation in northern Alberta states, "The land is paramount for all Indigenous societies. Their relationship to that land, their experience on that land, shapes everything around them." It was a very nuanced and powerful new approach to language which turns it into a cultural heritage containing knowledge about the land and its history. It describes the world around us, the plants, the animals, the ocean, the seasons. There is no language without the land. The Saanich Nation's traditional lands span from the southeastern top of Vancouver Island to the northern portion of the Olympic Peninsula. They are also known as the saltwater people as they live so close to the Pacific Ocean. The first language of this land is SENÇOԹEN, and it is a part of the Salish language family. For the Saanich people, the water which surrounds the land is integral to their way of life. The late elder Dave Elliott describes his childhood memories and recalls the reef net fishing under cedar canoes and how he spent most of his childhood in that tradition, fishing on trawlers. He describes how they didn't have much land, that their lives were centered around the sea. They had to be fishermen, sailors, navigators, and canoe builders. This intrinsic connection between the Saanich people and the sea is surely why the SENÇOԹEN language has such a deep connection to the ocean. Everything in the land has a name in SENÇOԹEN, names that hold knowledge about the land. Saanich elders describe difficulty when finding the English translations for these names. As much as a language is about communicating, it's also about how you view and think about the world. The names of the places in the Saanich territories are so important because they tell us about the use of that land, the images it resonates, and also the history and connection to their ancestors. There's a rocky beach next to Swartz Bay Ferry Terminal. Although I've passed this terminal many times, I've never noticed it. Upon inspecting Google Maps, this beach is there. However, it is given no name. When looking across the shore, you can see Piers Island. The original name for this beach can be translated to the chest in the water and is a clam digging area. Another example is Towner Bay, which is on the coast of the Saanich Inlet. Its name illustrates a tide that goes away. Both of these words in SENÇOԹEN not only give a name to the location, but also provide knowledge and perspective to this place. They are also both very connected to the ocean that borders the land. There's so many more name placements all over the Saanich territories which have been erased by settlers. This so deeply negates the history behind the land and aids in suppressing the existence of the Saanich people who have lived there for several millennia.
For those that are watching, I really encourage you to take a look at the names that you see in the locations in your everyday life and to reflect what is the significance of these names, who are they named after, and things of that nature. And then take it a step further and ask, what was the name before that? If you are able to find this research, I highly encourage you to share it in the comments, and I would love to see if you have made any insights about places that you go to regularly.
The 4 seasons and the 12 months are taught to us in primary school as an indisputable fact about the world. Even then, each individual word doesn't tell us anything about what happens during these seasons in that time. Although the distinctions between the seasons and the month isn't completely arbitrary, it is not the only way of keeping time. For the Saanich people, there are 13 distinct moods that divide the year. Each of these moons reflects what is going on in the land during that time. A majority of these moons can be translated to activities or concepts that are related to the ocean. The moon that occurs during May can be translated to the harvest of the seaweed. Many of the summer moon's translations are related to the salmon migration. From June through September, each of them represent the return of a different kind of salmon coming back to the earth from the ocean. Another moon that stood out was the one that occurred between the months of what we know as November and December. This can be translated as putting your paddles away, which is another ode to how the Saanich way of life is connected to the activities of the ocean. It is also the moon that we are in as I am speaking.
I want to discuss what drew me to the connection between SENÇOΘEN and the ocean in particular. I was looking through their dictionary and I was astonished by the amount of words that were about the ocean tide. There was tide, tide coming in, tide going out, high tide, low tide, half tide, spring tide, slack tide, zero tide, fast tide, ebb tide, fair tide, and bucking tide. Although these words can be translated to English, they're not discrete concepts the way they are in SENÇOΘEN. The expression of tide, I later realized, is so important because it gives telling indications of time. The Saanich people did not always tell the time directly through the day, the moon, or the sun, but rather they got clues from how the tide behaved. Understanding these tides allowed people to know when, for example, the herrings were coming in the early spring and could be fished.
Like many other Indigenous languages in Canada, SENÇOԹEN is currently endangered. However, we cannot claim that a language simply becomes endangered. Many factors have led to its vulnerability. In previous literature looking into language endangerment, it is described that language loss is often not voluntary. It frequently involves a violation of human rights pushed by repression. And this is exactly what happened to SENÇOԹEN along with so many other Indigenous languages through colonization. In 1846, the United States and Canada divided up the country and separated the territories inhabited by the Saanich Nation. This had a devastating impact as it cut off access to runs of salmon that they fished on to sustain themselves. The British Columbian government later outlawed their traditional reef nets in 1916. The loss of their fishing practice meant the suppression of a context in which SENÇOԹEN is used. The Saanich people were displaced and cultural traditions outlawed by white settlers who came to their land. And like so many other communities across Canada, residential schools tore children away from their families, causing generational trauma. Being punished for speaking the language of their culture created a negative connotation and stigma, which led many children to either lose their language or to not teach to future generations. Until the 1970s, when the residential school in the Saanich territories were closed, there was little institutional support for SENÇOΘEN as all schools, government activities, and main media were in English. SENÇOΘEN can be considered a severely endangered language, and most recent sources in 2018 count a total of 7 native speakers and around 110 learning speakers. Without the language and tradition, it is more difficult for the Saanich people to connect to the knowledge about their history, their land, and the ocean. Despite the devastation caused by European colonization, there is incredible movement forward towards language revitalization. This speaks to the resilience of the Saanich people more than anything. In 2012, a SENÇOԹEN immersion program was established along with a language nest for preschool-aged children. This is extremely valuable as it promotes a new and younger set of fluent speakers to carry the language. Having the language present in institutional spaces is a step towards reducing stigma established by residential schools and encourages its use in more contexts. SENÇOΘEN is currently vulnerable, but the work towards language revitalization is meaningful and will hopefully continue to bring progress.
Settlers like myself need to learn the history and knowledge about the land that we are living on. People treat the relationship with the land as a one-way transaction where we just take what we want excessively without giving back, and this needs to change. There are so many relationships one can have with the earth, and the relationship to the ocean that SENÇOΘEN has is just one of them. I think about language documentation and revitalization, and after getting to know more about SENÇOΘEN for the past couple months, I can't imagine a documentation without also capturing all these relationships that it has with the land. It would be an inauthentic documentation, and it would not serve the community. I urge us to be curious about Indigenous languages and to learn about the true names and history of the land that we live on. I think that we're often taught that British Columbia is young and doesn't have much history or culture. However, this is in direct opposition of the people that have lived here for thousands of years. And above all, I urge us settlers to step back and to give space to Indigenous voices in conversations about the land and their language. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it.